Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Strategy Talks and Mechanics Guide series. On this episode, I wanted to talk to you guys about what I think are the top 5 most underrated Mons in the community. I really think that people are kind of sleeping on these Pokemon, and a lot of people either just don't realize they exist in the game, or for some reason or another think that they're bad when they ultimately are not. Now, um, as to why that is, varies from Pokemon to Pokemon, and we'll dive right into that today. So, first, I wanted to mention is Abomasnow. Now, Abomasnow is in a bit of a weird spot for the longest time. It's was considered kind of a secondary egg option. Some people saw it for tomatoes, and like that's all right for tomatoes, but if you really look at it, it's pretty comparable for tomatoes compared to other top options, being within 1 tomato of productivity per day with no subskills natures. And as far as eggs go, I mean, yes, it is decently worse than Blissey, but if you have an ABB option, it's going to produce a pretty significant amount of eggs if you have the right subskills on it as well. And it's also producing some supplementary tomatoes, which something that oftentimes gets ignored is the supplementary A ingredient on a lot of ingredient specialists. That's why I personally really like Quaquaval still as a leak option. That's one of the reasons why, at least. With this guy, with Abomasnow, it's producing tomatoes, which is very nice if you're trying to make particularly the second highest salad, the one that takes 104 ingredients. It takes eggs and tomatoes. I believe it's like apple acid salad. It takes both those ingredients. So you're using it primarily for the eggs because it takes a lot of eggs. But making a few extra tomatoes on the side is just an added bonus to get more coverage. So you have to prep a little bit less ingredients or supplement a little bit less with something else. As long as it's producing the right amount of eggs, which with the right subskills in nature, you can push this to the point that it could easily, and if you're using good camp ticket, it could easily make that particular meal alright. So that's one that I think is slept on. Now, why do I think it's underrated by the community? I think the biggest reasoning why is because it's a Snowdrop exclusive. Snowdrop is kind of a cruddy island. It's not the best, so I don't necessarily recommend this to hunt. But I think it's a decent option if you happen to get a good one, as there are attributes of it that I think a lot of the community is sleeping on. But being a Snowdrop exclusive, it's pretty easy to get a decent Blissey now, just at Cyan Beach, if you hunt Hipini for a while. So it's understandable why this guy kind of flies under the radar. And as for tomatoes, same sort of thing. A lot of people don't like spending a lot of time at Snowdrop. Now, next one, Braviary. Now, Braviary is kind of in a weird spot because it's got Berry Burst. Now, a lot of the community is not too fond on Berry Burst. It's a very bizarre skill. It's kind of trying to be a generalist, but also kind of trying to be a berry specialist. But I think oftentimes when people try to evaluate it as a generalist, they just run the calculation with however Rain on X defaults it. I think this one is a fault of Rain on X as to why it gets overlooked, and also a matter of expense, which I'll come back to that. But if you compare it here, if we compare at the current level cap, then I made a comparison of if you run alongside 2 water Pokemon and 2 fire Pokemon in Rain on X. Now, obviously, that doesn't matter for Ampharos and Expion, but I gave water favored berry in this scenario, just for comparison's sake, because I feel like most teams probably have 1 to 2 other berry specialists or some Pokemon on the team that have favored berry, which is going to matter for Braviary's sake. Now, with this comparison, it's 42k versus 48k versus 46k compared to Ampharos and Espeon. The 2 other most commonly considered generalists, Golduck probably should be in here as well, but I wanted to save space. So I threw in these guys all for comparison's sake. But something else to give Braviary is that, given that it's off of higher value main skill procs, that proc less times per day, means that you're less likely to miss these procs than you would be on Ampharos or Espeon, or especially on Golduck. So it's an added value that it has, and if you can even get a 3rd or 4th, if you have a full team of favored berry specialists, then this guy is probably going to be a much better generalist than these ones, because it's producing on-type berries as well as its own. Additionally, a lot of players have compared it to Dodrio for Flying Berry. Now, it doesn't really necessarily outproduce Feraligatr at Cyan Beach. You can make comparisons there, and with the right subskills in nature, comparing, you probably can make it work better than that. But it's really kind of riding this weird line of generalist and Berry Specialist, but it also hurts if it has Favored Berry and it's running alongside something that doesn't have Favored Berry. So it also benefits most from levels. If the Pokemon in your team aren't very high level, then also that comes to hurt Braviary as well. So it's a very late game Pokemon. But something else that isn't very discussed about all the Berry Burst Pokemon is that if they ever had a main skill level 7, then that means this skill, or for Berry Burst, then that means this skill has dual scaling. It scales with skill level and with level, which means that it has a higher potential output way late game than realistically any other Pokemon in the game, having double that exponential scaling. I highly doubt that they'll add another level to the main skill Berry Burst because it scales off of level as well. So it already has late game scaling. The level is more just like a barrier you have to surpass before it can become viable. But it's a very interesting point to bring up as well regarding Braviary, and I think as we get later and later into the game, more people will recognize this Pokemon as a potential. Other problems with it though, you encounter it very early game. It's most useful very early in the game when you have to spend a lot of time at Cyan. And at this point, a lot of players have probably found something for Cyan Beach, as it is one of the first islands that you check off the mark for where to go to. And it takes main skill seeds, and when you're that early in the game, even if you do catch a good one, you probably don't have the seeds to invest into it because there are other options. And it's not very good early game because it doesn't have the levels to make its berries strong. So I think that's why it gets kind of a, not necessarily bad rap, but why a lot of players don't realize that it's actually got a lot of potential when used in the right circumstances. Now, the next one is Sudowoodo. This one I think primarily just comes from people see its speed stat and say that sucks, and then just don't look any further. But Sudowoodo has a really good skill trigger rate to make up for that. Now, when evaluating for total strength, especially at higher levels, it makes it decently weaker than the alternatives, because it's just hurting for berries, is the primary difference here. But as far as strength output goes, it is basically the same, actually slightly better than Espeon for skill strength output. So I don't know why this one gets overlooked. Another thing is probably that it takes an extra skill level, Ampharos doesn't. But a lot of people like Espeon, so realistically, people should be considering Sudowoodo as a generalist option. It really isn't that bad. But it's very easy to come by. Bonsly spawns quite a bit. Especially early game. I know you can counter a lot of them because they're baby Pokemon. And a lot of people said it's horrendous because they look at its slow speed, which it does have the slowest speed stat of any fully evolved Pokemon in the game. And its baby form is almost the slowest of all Pokemon in the game, including all unevolved. There's only, I think, the only thing slower than it is Paldean Wooper. So it's slow. It's god-awful slow, but it's got such a high skill trigger rate to compensate for that it actually does pretty well in spite of its very slow speed. But a lot of people think this guy's bad, and he's really not. So, yeah. Next one. Number 2. Number 2 I give to Alolan Ninetales. Now, I've talked about this one quite a bit. I think that Alolan Ninetales is one of the most overlooked Pokemon in the game and a very powerful berry specialist, potentially game-changing. But Alolan Ninetales runs into the same sort of problem that Abomasnow runs into, in that it is a Snowdrop only, realistically, Pokemon, meaning that you're not really going to be catching very many of them, especially because if you're going to Snowdrop, you probably already have a decent Walrein for the island, because it's a pretty late game island, and you probably want to do some prep for it, and one of the parts of that prep is finding a berry specialist for it, and Walrein is one of the best ones early game to catch in preparation for Snowdrop. So, given that this one exists at Snowdrop, makes it pretty difficult to justify using an Alolan Ninetales, or hunting an Alolan Ninetales, because by the time that it's accessible to you, you probably already have the role that it does filled. But I still think it's a very powerful berry specialist that a lot of people are missing out on. This top line up here is when I give every berry specialist, all fully evolved berry specialists, Berry Finding S and Favored Berry at their respective islands, evaluating for total strength. Rainon X actually likes the Alolan Ninetales quite a bit. Now, this is a bit of a flawed evaluation because it is assuming that it's proccing its main skill on itself all the time, which is why it's coming in quite a bit higher than these other ones. If I had to guess, it's probably more in between Meganium and Raichu, maybe even a little bit below the Raichu in total strength. But it all depends on the team context. One of the biggest problems with Extra Helpful S as a main skill, if you're trying to use it for general use and not for berry bombing, is that there's always a chance that it can misfire and proc on itself, bringing down the value of the main skill quite a bit. But Alolan Ninetales is unique in that it is the one berry specialist that has this main skill, which works really, really well, especially considering that it has Ice-type berry, which is one of the strongest berries in the game. So it proccing on itself is pretty much always going to be the best option available to it for where it could proc. So it's something that gets often overlooked, I feel, because people aren't considering the main skill on the berry specialists. But in this case, it actually contributes a decent amount of strength to its overall productivity when you consider that you could have a full team of berry specialists, and only 1 in 5 times is it going to be proccing on something you don't want to proc on, that being the healer, because I assume you're probably running a healer. So that's Alolan Ninetales and why I think that it's been overlooked by the community quite a bit. Now, before I get into the final one, I wanted to give some honorable mentions. These are all ones that I considered pretty heavily when I was making this slideshow, but ended up deciding not going with them for one reason or another. The first is the top 4 there. They're all for the same reason. They're the Energizing Cheer family of Pokemon. Energizing Cheer, I think, is a very balanced skill. I think it's balanced compared to other things like Charge Strength M, Charge Strength S, and it works. The problem with it is Energy for Everyone exists, and Energy for Everyone is an unbalanced skill that is centralizing. It's so overpowered to a point that it is centralizing, and the existence of Energy for Everyone makes Energizing Cheer redundant and useless. And that's why a lot of people say that all these Pokemon suck. They kind of do, given the context of the fact that Energy for Everyone exists. But I think it's actually a pretty balanced skill, and I think I'm the only person that can really speak as to that, being the person who's actually using Leafeon on the Sleep Sleepers account. I've actually found that in my calculations, it's pretty comparable to Charge Strength M for how much strength I'm getting out of it by running it instead of other options. So it's a pretty powerful main skill, balanced compared to most of the game, but Energy for Everyone just makes it useless, and that's the problem with these Pokemon. But ultimately, I still wouldn't say they're underrated because they are still bad in the meta of this game, because I still wouldn't suggest using them because Energy for Everyone exists. The next one in the little circle here is Umbreon. I think that it's underrated because Rain on X, if you actually try to use calculations with it, it completely ignores Umbreon's crit chance and doesn't use it in the energy calculation. It's gotten a lot of buffs, and I think that it's more usable than it once was. Originally, upon game release, it was the most useless Pokemon in the whole game. But it's a little bit better now, but it's still bad, which is why I didn't make this list, because I don't think it's underrated. It's still pretty bad. For a lot of the same reasons why the Energizing Cheer Pokemon are bad, but its main skill is even worse than Energizing Cheer for healing. So, but it is a little bit underrated because the calculator literally doesn't account for its crit chance whatsoever, like it does for every other skill. And I think that's unfair to Umbreon, if you want to give it a fair evaluation. Cramorant, I think, gets overlooked quite a bit because people evaluate it as just an ingredient specialist, which it is ultimately first and foremost an ingredient specialist, and it is one of the worst for oil. But its main skill is very valuable, and obviously Dedenne is going to be better for that purpose, but if you have a good Cramorant and you can use it for the oil, and while running it, it also happens to get Tasty Chance, it's the same sort of concept as what a lot of people say about Weavile. Running it 24/7 for that oil, running Weavile 24/7 for the berries, but then also getting the Tasty Chance is very, very valuable since it's a main skill. That doesn't really require a whole lot of procs to get a good amount of value out of it. And I think that a lot of people don't recognize that in Cramorant and kind of write it off as an option. I think another problem with it is that it's a 16-pip Pokemon, so it really shouldn't be anyone except for the whale's hunts. But it's an interesting Pokemon, and I think that given that it's a 16-pip, I wouldn't recommend it. And I think that it only deserves an honorable mention because, once again, same sort of thing as Umbreon. Even though it's interesting and can do some neat stuff, I don't think it's necessarily good. Because it is significantly worse for oil than the other options that exist, or potatoes as well. Mr. Mime, I feel like it's underrated quite a bit. Now, there are some of you out there that love Mr. Mime and its main skill, but I think a big thing about that is Its main skill is very intriguing, and I think it's really only underrated as a skill specialist, and that's just because it has the ingredient specialist tag. Its main skill is cool, but once again, first and foremost, the fact that it's got the wrong specialty is what creates a problem with Mr. Mime, and why I think that it's not necessarily overrated or rated fairly. I think if you use one that's very particularly skills focused, then there is some potential, but it's not still amazing. Then finally, Cresselia. I think a lot of people underrate Cresselia because it's got Berry Burst and it's got energy for everyone in the name, but it's more of a Berry Burst Pokemon. And then they just completely write off the energy. I made an entire video called The Case for Cress, talking about why I think it's actually a decent healer and why it can be your main primary healer. And a lot of people still look at it yet as being just a Berry Burst Pokemon, which is not fair to it in any capacity. But I think a lot of people recognize that it is still very, very strong, and still consider it when team building if they have a good one, or don't judge people if they have a good one and they run it. Which is why I felt like the community still recognizes it as good, and that's why it doesn't really deserve a spot on this list. So that's why all those Pokemon got honorable mentions. But the final one I wanted to discuss was Houndoom. Now, Houndoom, it really is only underrated for one reason and one reason only. It needs main skill seeds, but I think if you have a particularly good Houndoom, it is reasonable to invest your main skill seeds. And let me just kind of show you why. So this top comparison up here is comparing every Pokemon in the game if you were to full invest skill seeds into it for total strength. This is where generalists like Ampharos and Golduck do best. Now, if you compare Espeon as well, you can see that actually some berry specialists do a bit better as well. And I didn't even give them Berry Finding S here. I just gave them just raw skills for this comparison. And you can see that Houndoom actually does really, really well. Almost as good as a Drifblim. And honestly, it's only 2k behind, like, the family of Charge Strength Pokemon. It's not that far off from being a decent generalist, and if you have it with amazing stats, with Berry Finding S, with some skill trigger as well, the buff that it got to its main skill was big enough that I think it is still a reasonable consideration. And a lot of people will never give it that consideration because it's a berry specialist. Now, if we make a comparison at Snowdrop, giving all the favorite berries here. Now, I maxed out their main skills here, as you can see. Charge Strength M, Tasty Chance, Extra Helpful. Alola Tail still comes in technically the best, but that's in part due to the fact that the calculator assumes that it procs only on itself, which, it being a berry specialist, that's not always the full case. So take this with a grain of salt, but you can see that even compared to Weavile. Now, the calculator doesn't do very kindly to Weavile's main skill either, but it's very comparable for total strength output, and it's very comparable as a generalist as well. And I think that a lot of people are sleeping on Houndoom and not hunting Houndours because they never considered giving it main skill seeds. Now, I do think that this is more of a late game play because there are definitely other priorities for skill seeds. But if you would be willing to invest skill seeds into a Golduck or an Espeon for this purpose, if you catch a really good Houndoom first, then I think this is a reasonable target. And it only gets better than what they can do when it's at its favored berry island because it is still a berry specialist. It's not going to gain as much as, say, Weavile or Ninetales from being at its favored berry island or many other berry specialists in the game. But it's still very, very strong as a generalist, even off of just 2 procs a day of that Charge Strength M, because that Charge Strength M is such a powerful main skill. But anyway, that's about it for today's video. If you have enjoyed, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Down in the description, I'll have a link to join the Discord. You can come join us, hang out, talk about all things Pokemon Sleep and the like. Huge thank you to all my channel members. If you too want to become a channel member, the join button is down below. Feel free to click that if you're financially capable and wanting to do so. And as always, I thank you all for watching and hope that you all have a wonderful day. Bye-bye now.